these next 2 weeks are about parenting, culminating with Father's Day. But we're going to start out in a parenting relationship knowing that there are two halves, aren't there? It's the way you look to be parented and the way your parent looks at you. And this first half today is a lot about you. It's a lot about you. And next week will be a lot about how your greatest parent, the one that has known you before the foundations of the heavens and the earth, looks at you, sees you, knows you, and loves you. Now, sometimes to look ahead, we have to kind of look back at where we've been. And last week, we talked about graduates, and we honored them in a very intentional way. If you recall, the entire congregation of believers can be considered graduates, all of you, because you've come from death to life, the cold unknown to the warm knowledge of a Father who is intimately involved in everything that you are. Then we launched into VBS, a cave quest to introduce youngsters to the message of hope that Jesus provides. Parents and grandparents were thankful for the 2.5-hour break from, well, parenting. It was kind of a nice thing. And I'll tell you what, for me, the most thankful thing was on Thursday, my son, Jacob, some of you met, preached his first message in the children's worship center, and that was great. There's not a lot of dads that get to see their sons preach, and it was wonderful. This week, we dive headlong into parenting from a biblical perspective. Now, I'm going to do a flyover on this one, because the last time I was in Luke 15, we camped here for about a month or so, and I got to tell you something, this time I think it would take me 2 months just to go through this portion of Luke 15. It is so rich. What we're going to be offering in the fall, I wanted to let you know, is a short class, about a month or so, 3 weeks to a month on, you guessed it, biblical parenting. Probably do it on a Wednesday night. Probably be a great opportunity to invite in those folks that would just like an extra bit of perspective on parenting. What I'd like to do is examine Luke 15, verses 11 through 32 over the next 2 weeks. Now, as I said, this first week, we're going to talk about how we look to the Father for parenting. Next week, we're going to look at some of those principles about how God parents us, because from that, we'll be able to draw ways, techniques, and a heart condition of how to parent our children or grandparent our grandchildren. This is not just for those of us that have rugrats running around now. It's when you got the second generation or third generation that are in. This is going to help you out some. So if you would, turn in your Bibles to Luke 15, verses 11 through 32. And if you don't have a Bible handy, that's okay. Reach in a pocket in front of you or down the row and pull it out and follow along. Now, I'm going to read this in the NIV, and then we're going to study it in the more literal NASB, the New American Standard, but we're going to read it in the NIV, which is what most of you should have. So here we go. Verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Wow, what a great parable. Theologian Norval Gildenhausen, easy for me to say, says this is the gospel within the gospel when referring to the parable we commonly refer to as the prodigal son, because within it are so many gospel truths that are proclaimed. It's closely linked with the two parables that immediately precede it, but in this particular one, we see not only seeking the love of God, but the human side of sin and frailty. So what about the characters in this particular story? Who's the father? Who's the prodigal son? What about the other son? Well, let's start at the top. Let's go to verse 11, Luke 15. By the way, anytime people mention Luke and they say Luke 15, what's the first thing you ought to think? Prodigal son. Because that's what most people will zero in on in Luke 15, the prodigal son. So it says here in verse 11, I'm in the NASB now, the New American Standard. It says, "A man had two sons." Well, we know boatloads about the prodigal, but not as much about the other son, right? Well, we're going to cover the other son more next week. So let's start at the beginning about the guy that we do know a lot about. What does the word prodigal mean? Most people assume it means returning, the returning son. It actually means the opposite. It means, according to dictionary.com, wastefully or recklessly extravagant, giving or yielding profusely, lavish, lavishly abundant, profuse. As a noun, a person who spends or has spent his or her money or substance with wasteful extravagance, spendthrift. The opposite is provident, cautious. So now we know what the word means. I've got a question. When people read the prodigal son, what do? We have a tendency to put ourselves in the position of who? The prodigal, right? Because I've come back, right? I've come back. I was dead. Now I'm alive. So I've got a question for you. Does that really describe you? With what were you a prodigal? Are any of you destitute? Have you spent all of your riches? Are your bank accounts empty? Have you lost your house, your car, everything else? Probably not. But were you what you were wasteful with is probably the same thing I was. And that was my relationship with God, my salvation. I spent it like it didn't matter. Who cared? Hey, I had it. Now I spent it. I just went out and did what I wanted to do. That's what the prodigal did. Let's take a look at him. Verse 12 says, "The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me.' So he divided his wealth between them." Question for you. He asked for his inheritance. What has to happen for you to gain an inheritance? Somebody's got to die. He was saying to his father, "Hey man, I wish you were dead. Old man, I wish you were dead and gone so I could get what I want. I don't care about you, I care about me and what I get. So act like you're dead to me now and give me my money. Do you know how in the ancient Near East, this time period in Palestine, how they divided assets among sons? The eldest son got 2 portions. He got an additional portion. So of the total estate, the elder son gets 2/3, the younger son gets 1/3. Well, this man, the father, has not just riches, but also has land. So what he does is he gives the deed to 1/3 of the land and takes 1/3 of his riches and gives it to the son. And then in verse 13, by the way, if you think that this all happens at one time, it's over a little bit of a time stretch, because it says in verse 13, and not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living, it says, loose living. It says here that he gathered everything together. Well, if he had land, how could he gather together his land? He had to sell it. What do you have to do when you have to sell land in a hurry? Carol Patterson, you're a real estate agent. Yeah, if you want to get rid of property right now, what do? Cash deal, you bottom bucket it, right? You sell it for a song. So he sold out his family's land so that he could have money so he could take it all with him. And then he goes into a distant country. Well, if he goes to this distant country and he's got all this liquid cash, it doesn't seem like he's planning on coming back, does he? Where was his journey to? Now, I got to tell you something. We've tried to work this out, and unfortunately, this is not the best map in the world, and it should be, but it's not. We're working on that over the next few weeks. See, here's where he was, somewhere in Judea. Okay? Who are these folks over here? Can you see that where I'm pointing to? The Philistines. Were the Philistines nice people? Not to the Jews, they weren't. How about all the people all the way around the Jews? What about them? They all hated him desperately. He went to the land of his enemies, of his family's enemies, of his nation's enemies. He went and joined the other side. He was one of the allies, and he joined the Nazis. That's what he did. And then he had loose living. He squandered his estate with loose living. It says in the NIV, with prostitutes and having a big old party. It was Mardi Gras all the time. Now I got a question for you. When you're living like that, how many friends do you have? Tons, right? Tons that will be around you and want to partake in whatever it is you're buying. Whatever it is you're footing the bill for, you bet. I'm your best friend. I'm totally digging you, man. You're great. Yeah, let's hang out. Let's do some stuff together. What happens when the money dries up? Yeah, crickets chirping, right? You got nothing. Fair weather friends is what he has at this point. Because it says in the next verse, verse 14, it says, now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. And it says, verse 15, so he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. If you look at the end of verse 16, it says, and no one was giving anything to him. Where did all his friends go? His friends abandoned him because he didn't have money. He wasn't a big party guy anymore. So back to verse 14, it says, he had spent everything, enters this famine, and he started to starve to death. So he hires himself out. He goes and becomes a common laborer, but the lowliest of all kinds. He was a Jew. What is the nastiest, worst, most unclean animal or thing that a Jew can be associated with? Pigs. And where was he? Feeding pigs. He wasn't even guarding the pigs, looking out over the pigs. He was in the pig's slop, feeding pigs. That's how bad things got. What was he feeding the pigs? What was he feeding them? Slop. Well, yeah, okay, that's good. He was. Now, there's a farmer for you, okay. Yeah, it was slop. Now, their slop was a little bit different than ours, okay? Back then, it was a little bit different. In verse 16, it says, and he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. These are carob pods. Little to no nutritional value. A lot like the value of what he had been taking in and was squandering, his money. It had little value for him. The people that he was associating, the input he was getting was little or no nutritional value for his soul. And his friends who had been happy to help him spend his money now have no place, no time, or no money for him. By the way, carob is used, especially in the health food. I grew up in a health food store. Carob is used as a chocolate substitute. And way back in the day, it was really lousy. I mean, they didn't know how to process it that well, and it tasted awful. Today, it's not too bad. If you have a chance to taste a carob bar or something like that, it's not chocolate, but it's a close third. It's not bad. Okay, so, brothers and sisters, how many of us have walked away from our salvation? How many of us have squandered the gift we've been giving? You see, this parable applies to people that have yet to turn to the Father, but it also applies to those of us who've turned to Jesus, accepted his gift, and walked away. And if I can go one step further, can I say that every single person in this room, every person watching online, has done this to one extent or another. We've accepted Jesus' gift, and to one extent or another, we've all stepped away. Why? Because we like our comfort. We like what we do. We don't want to give things up. We don't want to sacrifice. We don't want, somewhere on this spectrum from Jesus, we all are, to one stage or another. Now, maybe you're someone who knows what you've been told to do, but choose to do something else. And now you figure you're so far down that path that Jesus couldn't want you back. Your salvation is secure, but you've worked your way to the second string of his favorites because of your shame. You figure, I'm a second stringer, I'm never getting in the game again with Jesus. I'm not going to know that wonderful close relationship that I have with him because I'm too far down the path. Could you be somebody like me that no matter what you do, you feel inadequate in Jesus' eyes? Because occasionally you have a temper, or you're chippy with people, or you desire your comfort over sacrifice. Do you believe that that disqualifies you from being in his presence? I bet the prodigal son felt all of those things. Just as I bet you have at one time, or maybe even right now. But those are things we don't talk about openly, are they? They're whispered to your conscience somewhere in the dark, and there's condemnation there. There's shame. There's guilt. Anybody else struggle with that stuff besides me? Don't raise your hand. It's okay. Yeah, I saw one hand start to shoot up. No, you don't have to tell everybody. Yeah, but you know what? Sure. I struggle with that all the time. Total inadequacy in front of Jesus. John 21 details the story of Jesus meeting the disciples on the shore after his resurrection. Peter, who had denied Christ, had walked away from everything and had gone back to what he had known before. It says in John 21:3, Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. That's it. I'm done. I denied Christ. I started walking down this path, and you know what? I went too far. There's no way I got any way back. I'm going fishing. And what did they do? They went with. Later, Jesus meets them on the shore and specifically asks Peter not to clean himself up. but simply to turn back to Christ. He asked Peter 3 times, the number of times Peter denied knowing Jesus, if he loved him. He said, Peter, do you love me? Once turned back, Jesus tells Peter to follow me. Did Jesus say to Peter, go clean yourself up and then I'll receive you? Go atone for your sin and I'll look the other way? No. Jesus went to the Sea of Tiberias to meet the disciples in general and Peter specifically. Strange. This is much the same as the father in the story of the prodigal. We read it at the beginning. Do you see the parallels? The first part of the parable is just like Peter deciding to go fishing. He just leaves. He's despondent over what he's done. He knows he's not walking with the Lord. The prodigal knows he's not where he's supposed to be. He's among the pagans. He's made himself into an enemy of where he came from. Now here's the question. How many of us have gone fishing? Where are you in the land? Let's be honest. Let's not try to appear all cleaned up. Where are we? Can you honestly say that you're squandering your inheritance? I know there have been times in my life when I've squandered mine, like yesterday, like this morning. It's a daily battle, but one we have to admit that we're in. We need help in that battle. And here comes the help. Let's look back to Luke 15. Let's pick up in verse 17. Some really, really cool words here. He says, but when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? When he came to his senses, when he took stock of where he was. How many of us look inwardly? How many of us have a call from a pastor on a Sunday morning saying, look, I don't want you to clean yourself up. I don't want you to figure out how to get back there. All I want you to do is take stock of where you are, because you're somewhere here. You're somewhere on this road. To one degree or another, every single person in this room is. So I said we need some help, right? Let's read on. Verse 18, it says, I will get up and go to my father. Oh, wait a second. I'm going to turn back to the Father. And I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. When it says this in the NASB, just so you know, the word heaven there is a replacement word for God. And the prodigal says that so as not to speak God's name. So he's saying, I've sinned against God and in your sight. And then verse 19, and here's the kicker. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. He gives full and unconditional confession to his sinful acts. He's humble. He expects nothing. He realizes he deserves nothing and will ask for the lowliest of jobs. Admitting his lack of expectation of any honor whatsoever, of being deserving and taking personal responsibility for sin, is the indispensable quality of repentance. And the prodigal right here exhibits it fully. We can learn a great lesson from the prodigal. God doesn't care about what you try to do to make it right. God cares about you owning whatever that sin is. Saying, I've sinned. I have. And Lord, I'm turning to you. Boom! You make the turn, and that's where something happens. So we see the initial character of the prodigal and the came to my senses prodigal in the first half of this section. Initially, he just wants what he wants, and it's all about him and what he wants and what he's going to do. And then he comes to his senses and says, oof, I had it all, and I squandered it. He takes stock of himself, and he turns to the Father. When we continue on to the end of the parable, we see the character of God then on display in that second portion. We're assured that God approaches sinners. Yes, he approaches with open arms. And when they turn toward him, we're assured that we haven't done anything so egregious that he will turn away. We see that he loves us so much that he'll do what shouldn't be done by someone in his position. He runs, he kisses, he hugs. Bottom line, he loves us when we come with nothing but ourselves. He loves us when we can't love ourselves. How unlovable do you think the prodigal felt when he came to his senses? He's in a pig field, in slop, trying to eat carob pods to stay alive and starving to death after wasting everything that he had been given. You think he felt like he deserved anything or he was doing really great? No, he realized he was at the end of himself. Reflect back on the parable. Again, did the Father say, clean yourself up and then I'll receive you? Wash off your filth. Turn to me and only then will you be acceptable? Absolutely not. We have to turn. This is how God parents us. He meets us right where we are. After we've been rolling around in pig poop, we're filthy, we're dirty, we're unworthy, we're unclean, we're destitute, and we're empty. And what does he do? He only adorns us with personhood, a royal seat at the table of a feast of his making, status as his son or daughter, to sit with him not as a servant, but as a prince or a princess. All we have to do is turn. He's looking. He's scanning the horizon for you. He's eager to run toward you. Now look, brothers and sisters, if you've been off in the distance, if you've been pursuing other things, if you've been squandering your inheritance because you got one the day you turned to Jesus Christ, don't clean yourself up. You can't. He can. Just turn. And you know what? If you say, well, Mark, I am turned. Okay, well, maybe you're turned this much. So just turn that much more. Or turn that much more. Just that extra degree or two. And allow God to pour his grace out upon you. Christian and non-Christian, listen up. I'm talking to both of you. If you've never walked toward the Father, then come. Turn for the first time. Start the walk toward your Father today. Come join me up here when the deacons come up and we pray for you. If you know the Lord, but you've been farther off than is good for you, farther off than you know you want to be, farther off than you were made to be, then come. Turn back. Lose your pride. Set it aside and come walk up here so we can pray for you and with you. Henry Nouwen says in his book, The Inner Voice of Love, it's not going to be easy to listen to God's call. I want you to hear this. Your insecurity, your self-doubt, and your great need for affirmation make you lose trust in your service, and you run away from yourself. Your service to God. You run away from yourself. But you know that God speaks to you through your inner voice and that you'll find joy and peace only if you follow it. I think that's a great quote because it acknowledges that we have insecurity, self-doubt, and a great need for affirmation. And that's what causes us to lose trust in the fact that our inner voice tells us we need to run toward God. So it's hard to do that. It's hard to walk up here on Sunday because we listen to that voice. Now, I got to tell you something. That's an invitation from Henry Nouwen to come up here to lay yourselves out for the Lord, to put yourself where you belong at his feet. I invite you to lay down your entire being up here and declare before the Father that you're back. Not because you're clean, but because you've turned toward him. That's my invitation to you. If you've never done that before, please come up here. If you have done that before and you need prayer, you need to lay down some things that are weighing on you, come up here. You want to be baptized, come up here and talk to me. You want to know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, come tap me on the shoulder, because I'm going to be praying for you right now.